All right, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to be looking at the architects of history, but through a completely different lens. We usually think of history's greatest inventors as these solitary geniuses who just had a light bulb go off, shouted Eureka, filed a patent, and bam, changed the world. But the source material we're digging into today reveals a much, much darker structural reality. We're going to examine the specific legal and systemic failures, the hidden loopholes, the blind spots, and honestly, the outright corruption in early intellectual property laws that literally allowed world-changing inventions to be legally credited to the totally wrong people. And this quote right here, this is the absolute core of what we're unpacking today. See, intellectual property systems like patents, they were originally designed to protect individual brilliance, right? They were meant to be a shield for the creator. But the historical record actually proves that this system frequently acted as a sword for the powerful. It favored money, corporate leverage, and sneaky legal maneuvering over actual, genuine innovation. And when the system fails like that, it doesn't just hurt one person's pride. It legally alters the entire course of human history. So here is our structural autopsy for today. We're going to cover patent office corruption, then corporate erasure, unprotected scientific data, historical contracts, and finally, we'll take a look at the true architects. Let's start right off with Section 1, Patent Office Corruption, and what's known as the telephone's 2-hour margin. To really understand how fragile intellectual property law used to be, we have to go back to Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1876. Because this is the day two men, Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray, both arrived at the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C., carrying designs for the exact same revolutionary concept, the telephone. Now, to grasp the massive legal failure here, we need to understand this term caveat. Back then, it was a formal legal notice of intent to patent. It's basically a legal placeholder. On that specific day, Alexander Graham Bell's lawyer filed an application for a design that Bell hadn't even built yet. But Elisha Gray, he filed a legal caveat for a fully tested device, one that had actually already successfully transmitted sound over a wire. So think about that. Gray had the working technology, Bell just had the legal paperwork. Look at the timeline here. It's crazy. Notice this razor-thin margin. Bell's lawyer files at 11:30 a.m. Gray files his caveat less than 2 hours later. That tiny, less than 2-hour window legally decided the multi-billion-dollar future of global telecommunications. Bell was awarded the patent, and Elisha Gray, despite literally having a working invention, died in 1901, entirely uncredited in the history books as the father of the telephone. But the system didn't just fail because of a clock, it failed because of what was happening behind closed doors. This is where it gets wild. The source documents a shocking, fully confessed bribery. Years later, patent examiner Zenas Wilbur signed a sworn affidavit admitting he was an alcoholic who had actually taken money from Bell's lawyer. Wilbur confessed that he illegally showed Bell's team the highly confidential caveat that Gray had filed. And following that, Bell's application was allegedly modified overnight to include the exact technical details from Gray's working model. The patent system was designed to protect the very first inventor, but here it just protected the first person to pay off the examiner. Moving on to Section 2, Corporate and Military Erasure, or Leverage over Innovation. This is where we see how immense financial and institutional power just completely steamrolled individual creators in the courts. Basically, if you didn't have the legal resources to defend your patent, your invention simply became someone else's property. Take the invention of the radio, for example. Nikola Tesla legally patented the fundamental technology for the radio in 1897. But after he lost his funding and went bankrupt, Guglielmo Marconi filed his own patent using 17 of Tesla's designs. Now, initially, the patent office did its job and rejected Marconi. Good, right? But then, in 1904, they suddenly reversed their decision and gave Marconi the patent anyway. Why? Well, historians link this completely unprecedented legal reversal directly to Marconi's extremely powerful corporate investors, which included heavyweights like Thomas Edison and Andrew Carnegie. Corporate leverage just completely overrode a pre-existing legal patent. And speaking of Edison, we see a totally different kind of corporate erasure with the light bulb. Thomas Edison's original light bulb was honestly kind of a fragile novelty. It burned out in just a few hours. The guy who actually made it a practical, durable tool that the world could use was Lewis Latimer. He patented a massively superior carbon filament in 1881. But Latimer went to work for Edison Electric as a technical expert. And through the legal structure of corporate employment, Latimer's crucial, world-changing patent was completely absorbed into Edison's brand. The corporate structure legally erased the individual contributor from the mainstream narrative.
Which brings us to the ultimate institutional erasure, the military. Zero. Yep, zero. That is exactly how many cents the U.S. military paid to Hollywood actress and self-taught engineering genius Hedy Lamarr. Back in 1942, she co-patented a brilliant frequency hopping technology to prevent Allied torpedoes from being jammed by the enemy. She handed it right over to the Navy for the war effort. And what did they do? They shelved it. Actually, scratch that. They let her patent expire and then quietly began using it. They legally absorbed her brilliance entirely under the guise of national security.
It took 55 agonizing years for her to receive any recognition at all. Because the military let her patent expire, the technology just floated into the public domain. And guess what? It became the entirely unregulated foundation for modern Wi-Fi, GPS, and Bluetooth. We are talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry built on her uncompensated intellect. She finally got an Electronic Frontier Foundation Award when she was 82 years old. The legal system required to protect her invention simply abandoned her. All right, let's shift to Section 3, unprotected scientific data, where academic trust was heavily exploited. See, in the academic world, there was this massive legal blind spot. There was absolutely no formal legal framework protecting raw, pre-published data. Scientists just relied on trust, and historically, that trust was totally exploited. The invention of the computer is a perfect example of this. John Atanasoff built the first electronic digital computer in 1937. Trusting a fellow academic, he shared his unpatented machine with a guy named John Mauchly in 1941. Mauchly hung around for days taking super detailed notes. Fast forward 4 years, and Mauchly formally patented those exact same binary and electronic switch concepts under his own name for the famous ENIAC machine. The utter lack of IP protection on raw academic research allowed a simple visitor to legally claim ownership of the entire future of computing. Now, in 1973, there was a ruling by Judge Earl Larson that finally invalidated the ENIAC patents and legally recognized Atanasoff. So the justice system finally worked, but it arrived decades too late. By 1973, Mauchly had already gotten incredibly rich, and his name was permanently printed in an entire generation of textbooks. A late legal victory doesn't magically rewrite the cultural history that's already been established by a stolen patent. And that exact same legal blind spot robbed Rosalind Franklin. Her unprotected X-ray crystallography data, the extremely famous Photo 51 that actually showed the double helix of DNA, was shared with James Watson without her consent. Because raw lab data wasn't protected the same way a formal patent is, Watson and Crick used it as the absolutely critical foundation for their 1953 paper. They won the Nobel Prize. Franklin died uncredited. The legal frameworks of the time completely failed to protect the foundational data of a massive scientific discovery. This brings us to Section 4, contracts that rewrite history. The first flight. This is perhaps the most shocking failure we're looking at today because it reveals how private legal contracts can literally dictate the public's understanding of historical facts. Let's look at the first airplane flight. We all know the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in December 1903, right? Well, the source material highlights some incredibly compelling evidence that a man named Gustav Whitehead flew a powered aircraft more than 2 years earlier, in August 1901. He had documented eyewitnesses and newspaper accounts. In fact, it's so compelling that in 2013, the highly respected publication Jane's All the World's Aircraft actually updated their records to officially credit Whitehead with the first flight. So, why is Kitty Hawk the only name we all know? It all comes down to this 1948 contract. The Smithsonian Institution signed a legally binding contract with the Wright brothers' estate. And get this, the contract explicitly mandates that the museum must display the Wright Flyer as the first heavier-than-air craft. If they ever acknowledge anyone else, like Whitehead, the estate has the legal right to just reclaim the aircraft. It is literally a private legal contract artificially locking competitors out of historical recognition. The narrative wasn't decided by facts or science, it was decided by lawyers. Finally, Section 5, the true architects and the cost of broken systems. We've seen how intellectual property law, which was intended to foster and protect innovation, was systematically manipulated to erase the actual innovators. And this summary brilliantly illustrates the whole picture. We can directly map these staffs to specific systemic legal failures. Tesla lost the radio to Marconi because of unchecked corporate influence overriding patent decisions. Atanasoff lost the computer to Mauchly because of a total lack of legal protection for raw scientific data. Hedy Lamarr lost the foundation of Wi-Fi because military appropriation legally stripped her of her intellectual rights.
The legal system didn't just fail them, it failed them perfectly.
Which leaves us with this final, kind of unsettling question. If these are just the high-profile cases, the ones where enough evidence somehow survived for historians to find the truth, how many more are out there? How many brilliant minds had their life's work legally absorbed simply because they lacked the lawyers, the money, or the institutional power to defend their own ideas? The history of innovation isn't always written by the brightest minds. It's often written by the strongest legal teams. Keep that in mind the next time you read a history book. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you think you know.